All we hear are these people are trying to get into our country. This is all these threats are coming from all over the place. Why are they coming? Where are they coming from? So we want this really to be like a discussion, like very organic, but I'd like to leave it at that part and maybe have Professor Chomsky, if you like, to talk about neoliberal policies and stuff like that.
Stuff like that. Well, my main contribution to this issue is to have two daughters, one of whom, Avi, who you mentioned, is one of the leading specialists on this topic. In fact, she just came back from a couple of weeks in Arizona with students at the college where she teaches, Salem State, and others, doing border monitoring, legal work in Nogales, where a lot of immigrants people who are caught on this side of the border are put into what amounts to cattle cars and trucked through Nogales and dumped in Mexico on the Mexican side. There's things called court cases, but it's kind of like military commissions. It doesn't count as a court case. And another daughter who just decided, who was a Brown student, incidentally, and after graduating and working at the American Math Society for a while, decided she wanted to live like a third world woman, so she went down to Nicaragua, and she's been living there, works for Oxfam, husband, 2 kids. So yes, they're on the other side. Gabe mentioned that most of this started in the early 90s. And there's a reason why it started in the early 90s. In fact, 1994, the year when Clinton initiated Operation Gatekeeper, militarizing the border, was the same year that NAFTA passed. And it was understood that by here that the effect of NAFTA would be to undermine Mexican agriculture, which may be efficient, but it can't compete with U.S. agribusiness that gets a large percentage of its profits from state subsidies, thanks to Ronald Reagan and other free market apostles. So it's going to undermine Mexican agriculture. It's going to drive people off the land. And they also understood that Mexican businesses cannot compete with U.S. Corporations, huge U.S. corporations, which are granted the right of what's called national treatment in Mexico. So if, say, General Motors invests in Mexico, they are entitled to claim the same treatment as a Mexican company. Now, that's a right that holds only for corporations, not for people. If a Mexican manages to come to New York and asks for national treatment, if he's lucky, he won't be in Guantanamo. But these are special rights granted to corporations, among the many that are granted to corporations well above those that human beings have. And NAFTA enshrined a lot of them. They're also in the World Trade Organization rules and in the whole so-called neoliberal framework. Well, there's another factor. Throughout the 1980s, the U.S. was carrying out murderous terrorist wars all through Central America. A lot of the people who are coming are indigenous people from farther south. Guatemala, El Salvador, these places were devastated. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, all kind of torture and terror. It was almost all due to, there have been truth commissions, almost all the responsibility of the U.S. run state terrorist forces, or in the case of Nicaragua, the Contra Army, just a mercenary force. So in some areas, like say the Guatemalan highlands, Mayan areas, it was real genocide. I mean, total devastation. Actually, there are Mayan communities around here. They keep kind of quiet because, as undocumented immigrants do, and also around not too well near where my daughter lives. She's working with Mayan groups that are up there. Well, these people were fleeing from disasters. A part of it was just the terrorist disaster of Reagan's wars. Part of it is the neoliberal disaster. That is the imposition of a certain kind of economic regime which required a cutback in state services, a cutback in services for the poor and local development and so on, and acceptance of what's called opening up, which means you give up to the biggest power. So like U.S. agribusiness or U.S. manufacturers who turn parts of Mexico into assembly plants from which Mexico gets very little, but it's good for the corporations. It's terrible for American workers, but that's not one of the goals of policy. I mean, in the United States, for a majority of the population, real wages have pretty much stagnated for about 30 years. That's the neoliberal period. During the period of financialization of the economy here and the hollowing out of production, which means you don't stop production, but it's just done elsewhere, like Mexico, China, Vietnam. That's fine for the banks, and it's great for the owners and stockholders, but it's terrible for the population here, and it's much worse for the population in Mexico. In fact, NAFTA is one of those rare treaties, maybe the only one, which has actually harmed the majority of the population in all three participating countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and of course Mexico worst. And in addition to that comes the treatise of the American wars in Central America, all trying to flee. The timing of the militarization of the border is not accidental. And incidentally, the American population was opposed to NAFTA. So were the Canadians. In Mexico, we don't have very good evidence, but it looks like Mexicans were opposed too. So this was not an agreement, at least if people are part of their countries. It's called the North American Free Trade Agreement. The only accurate words in that phrase are North American. It was in Mexico, United States, and Canada. It wasn't an agreement if people are part of their countries because they were opposed, and it certainly wasn't a free trade agreement. It has highly protectionist elements, and a lot of it isn't about trade at all. Like, for example, granting national treatment to U.S. corporations. It has nothing to do with trade. Trade is put in there so you can sort of sell it, and free is put in there to make it sound good. But it's an agreement designed in the interests of the people who designed it. It's not a great surprise. It was designed by multinational corporations and the few states, ours in particular, that primarily cater to their interests. And sure, so they're doing fine. After all, it's their treaty. But the population is not. And there's absolutely nothing new about this. I mean, these are truisms. It goes back to the origins of industrialization. In fact, you can read about this in Adam Smith. We're supposed to worship Adam Smith, but you're not supposed to read him. It's too dangerous. He's a dangerous radical. I mean, one of the things he pointed out is that he was concerned with England. He said that in England in his day, 1776, this is Wealth of Nations, what he called the principal architects of policy are the merchants and manufacturers of England. And they institute policies which make sure that their interests are well catered to, however grievous the effect on others, including the population of England. That's not their concern. And of course, even worse, what he called the savage injustice of the British in India. He's an old-fashioned conservative who had moral values. You'd have to be a Diogenes to find one today. But he was a real old-fashioned conservative. He had moral values, and he could see elementary truths, like the fact that policy is designed by those who concentrate economic power in their hands. And they design policy for their own good, no matter what happens to others. That's secondary. Well, things haven't changed that much since 1776. And now these views are called, radical or Marxist or some other bad word, but they're just truisms. I mean, in a free country, you'd learn them in elementary school. In fact, how else could it work? It'd be amazing if it didn't work that way. And NAFTA is a perfectly good example. It was designed by, now it doesn't happen to be merchants and manufacturers. It's, financial institutions and multinational corporations. But the logic is pretty much the same. What happens to the population is what's called in economics courses an externality. if you've taken an economics course, you know that when you make a transaction, you buy a car or something, the participants in a transaction, according to economic theory, look out for their own interests. And then they're kind of like side effects, what happens to other people. That's a footnote. That's called an externality. Well, the externalities can be pretty large, like say the current financial crisis is an externality. When Goldman Sachs and AIG and so on make transactions, they look out for their own benefit. They don't pay attention to what's called systemic risk, the risk that the whole thing's going to collapse. And they're right not to do that, because then, since they are the masters, pretty much run the government, they can count on the government to ensure that the taxpayer bails them out. So they should make risky investments and loans, because they got an insurance policy from you. So yeah, that's the way they do it. And there are other externalities which are even worse. Of course, the people of Mexico and Guatemala and El Salvador and the United States, their fate is an externality, but so is the fate of our grandchildren. For example, if you take a look at today's polls, the last couple of days, there are new polls on attitudes of Americans towards global warming, and it keeps going down. And by now, about a third of the population think that, believe in anthropogenic global warming. Humans have something to do with global warming. It's being relentlessly driven down by a massive propaganda barrage telling people it's all a liberal hoax, so forget about it. Now, the guys who are running these campaigns know perfectly well that the liberal hoax is very real, and it could destroy the lives of their grandchildren. In fact, it could destroy everything they own. And in their personal lives, decent human beings, they understand that. But in their institutional lives, as, say, executives of a corporation, they have to play an institutional role. The institutional role is maximize profit and market share. In fact, that's a legal requirement, and ignore the externalities. Well, in this case, the externality happens to be the survival of the species, but the logic is the same as systemic risk, the same as Adam Smith's grievous effects on the population of England. These are inherent properties of market systems, and you can call them inefficiencies if you like, but they're massive. Well, NAFTA had these effects as anticipated. Reforms began in Mexico in the 1980s. They were the result of policies. Actually, what happened is the World Bank and the U.S. Treasury and others had been, through the 70s, had been trying to, induce, demand or insist that third world countries borrow like mad from U.S. Lenders. So they were tremendously, these are usually third world dictators. They did what they were told. So they should borrow from U.S. banks, and they did. They were hugely in debt. American banks were wildly overexposed to debt, like Citigroup, which is collapsing now, also collapsed in 1981 and was bailed out by your parents. That's the way the system works. The debt crashed when Reagan came in, actually Carter, late Carter, early Reagan, and Paul Volcker, who's Fed head, raised interest rates very high to wipe out inflation in the American economy. Well, the U.S. went into a deep recession, it's Reagan recession, but it pulled out. It's a rich country. On the other hand, the third world countries couldn't. Their debts were indexed to U.S. Inflation. So as to the U.S. dollar, as it went down, they got huge debts, which they couldn't pay. The punishment for that was what were called structural adjustment programs. In the United States, if the rich guys crash the economy, we bail them out. But in the poor countries, if the rich guys crash the economy, the poor bail them out. It's called a structural adjustment program, meaning you stop public services, you cut back on support for agriculture, you put all your money into paying debts and so on. In fact, the prescriptions for the poor countries are the exact opposite of the prescriptions for the rich countries. Here, when you have a recession, The government produces a big stimulus, it bails out the bankers, and so on and so forth. Poor countries, the opposite. You pay off your debts, you cut back production, you cut back services, and you suffer. That's how you pay it off. The poor people, the mass of the population didn't. The debts were not owned by them. They didn't have anything to do with the debts. The debts were incurred by their wealthy rulers, but the poor pay it off. It's a racket. The racket is known as the International Monetary Fund. The executive director of it, an American, was honest enough to describe it as the credit community's enforcer, meaning if rich banks here make loans to third world dictators and they can't pay them back, then the poor in the country that borrowed pay our creditors here, and incidentally, so does the North American taxpayer. They pay off the banks to make sure that they're doing fine. It's just what's happening before our eyes. It keeps happening regularly. It's built into the system. Notice that this is exactly the opposite of what a capitalist economy would be. There's a lot of talk about capitalism, which is mostly a joke. In a capitalist economy, if I lend you money, and and I know that it's risky, so I'll lend it at a high interest rate because it might go sour. So I make a lot of money for the interest. And if it turns out at some point that you can't pay, that's my problem. Not in the international scene. If Citigroup makes a loan to Mexico and knows it's risky, so they high interest rates, so they get a ton of profit, and then it crashes, doesn't work like a capitalist system. They don't pay for it. They don't suffer for it. The American taxpayer bails them out, and the poor in the poor countries have to pay off the debt by structural adjustment programs. So Mexico was, every country that's been subjected to these neoliberal rules, including even us, has suffered from it. Like growth radically declined, other macroeconomic measures declined, and pretty obvious why. But the rich did fine, just like here. We're kind of like a microcosm of it. We're such a rich country, it doesn't have the same effects, but it's basically the same structure. Well, okay, here you have a bunch of attacks on the country south of the border. The neoliberal programs, the terrorist wars, the flooding of their productive apparatus by subsidized U.S. Agribusiness by major U.S. corporations they can't compete with. Well, the obvious effect is there's going to be a flow of people from the devastated countries to the rich country, which is responsible for it. So that's illegal immigration. Up until the early 90s, the border was pretty open. It was a porous border. Same people lived on both sides. They'd cross the border to visit their families and that sort of thing. Like other borders, it was based on conquest. The United States just conquered half of Mexico. What we call the Southwest is Mexico. That's why the city names, San Francisco, Los Angeles, are all Spanish names. It was Mexico. We conquered it. And it was a pretty open border. But once it was clear to the Clinton administration that there's going to be a flood of people coming as a result of the policies they're imposing, they militarized the border. That's why it starts in the early 90s. And it's gotten harsher and harsher. As the effects get worse and worse, the punishment gets harsher and harsher. And it has an internal effect here. It's a way of disciplining the domestic population here. So I don't have to tell you, there's huge propaganda here to get people to blame their plight on illegal immigrants. If I don't have a job and like my wages have stagnated for 30 years because the liberals are giving everything away to the illegal immigrants. You want to hear this, just listen to Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Sarah Palin, Tea Parties. So it's a good way of making sure that the people who you're smashing in the face don't do anything about it and blame someone else. Like the Nazis blamed the Jews. Okay, we blame the illegal immigrants and the blacks. They're the ones who are responsible for what we're suffering. So it's a way of controlling and disciplining this population too. And it's not that they didn't know what they were doing. They knew exactly what they were doing. You go back to the top planning around 1990, you know, at that time in the government. For example, there was a Latin American strategy workshop in the Pentagon in 1990, where they were looking over the long-term consequences, actually, of U.S.-Mexico relations. And they decided that U.S.-Mexico relations were great. It's true that Mexico is full of torture and starvation and these insignificant things, but relations were great. But they noticed one cloud on the horizon. The cloud was what they called a democracy opening in Mexico. There might be a democracy opening in Mexico, which would threaten the domination of U.S. economic and political power over Mexico. So you had to stop a democracy opening. Well, one way to do it was NAFTA. That, in fact, it was understood that NAFTA, I'm quoting now, would lock Mexico into the reforms. The term reform doesn't mean reform. It means, you know, doing things our way. That's called a reform. So it would lock Mexico into the neoliberal programs by a treaty. So if the danger, there was a democracy opening took place, there wouldn't be anything they could do about it because it would be locked in by treaty. Okay, that's NAFTA. You lock the programs in by treaty, and then if a dangerous democracy opening takes place, well, we're kind of protected from it. This is the open thinking. It's perfectly sensible. It's just Adam Smith's truisms applied to the current period. And it shows up in all kinds of ways. I mean, one of the interesting ways it shows up is in American law. I mean, you know, when you were at junior high school, you read the amendments to the Constitution. There is an amendment called the 14th Amendment, which says that no person shall be deprived of rights without due process. Okay? No person. Well, that's no good. And the courts have since changed that law in two ways. For one thing, they both expanded and restricted the notion of person. So over the late 19th century, and primarily about a century ago, corporations were given the rights of persons. This infuriated conservatives because it was a direct attack on the principles of classical liberalism, which holds that rights inhere in persons, not legal fictions that are constructed by government laws. But corporations were given the rights of persons. And slowly that meant freedom of speech, freedom from search and seizure, you know, on and on. And then when you get to the trade agreements, they get rights way beyond persons, as I mentioned. So that's one way in which the notion of person was changed. In fact, when the courts dealt with 14th Amendment cases, it was almost all for corporations. The intent of the people who initiated it was for slaves to be protected by it, but they're poor and weak and so on, so they had no way of appealing. But corporations are big and strong, so they did, and the courts gradually incorporated them into the notion of person, and now it goes way beyond. Just last January, the Supreme Court gave corporations the rights to buy elections. You know, pretty open. So you can buy elections because you're persons. Persons have freedom of speech, and money is speech, so you want to buy election, go ahead and do it. So that's one change in the notion person. The other change is, what do you do about people like undocumented aliens? Well, okay, the courts have decided over the years that they are not persons, literally. So these people are being picked up by the Border Patrol, stuck in cattle cars, if they make it alive, and shipped back across the border. They're not under the jurisdiction of the 14th Amendment because they're not persons. And in fact, if you look at what's going on in Congress, the two political parties are sort of competing with each other to see which one can be more savage in denying rights to these non-persons who happen to be here without papers. And all of this goes on at the same time that the courts and much of Congress is granting more rights to General Motors and General Electric and Goldman Sachs and so on, because they are persons, in fact, super persons. Well, that's our legal system. And nobody talks about it because that's the way power is supposed to operate. And you're not supposed to know about it. You're not supposed to be able to read the words of the 14th Amendment because that's too scary. So people can scream about taking our Constitution away from us, but they're not talking about this. These are real things, and it's playing out in human lives the way you're describing, very brutally, in fact. And it's this new law that's coming through is a real horror. In fact, the law that's coming through criminalizes everybody in Arizona who looks as if they might be Latino. I mean, they can have been born here, their parents can have been born here. They have to walk around with documents all the time. I mean, just think how you'd feel if you had to walk around with documents all the time proving you're a citizen. You have to have them because the police have the right to stop you if they think you might not be pure white. They have a right to stop you and demand that you give proof of citizenship. And if you don't happen to have it on you, you can be sentenced. And furthermore, other citizens, the blue-eyed blonde ones, if they see somebody walking down the street and a police who looks Latino and the policeman doesn't stop them, they can sue the police for not stopping them and demanding their citizenship. So this essentially criminalizes a substantial part of the population. In fact, the part that comes from the country which we conquered. We conquered it and took it, and there's a lot of people there who are what we call Latino in background. Okay, they're criminalized. And as you said, this can easily extend beyond. In fact, under Obama, it's gotten much worse. I mean, the number of raids to toss out undocumented immigrants has increased pretty sharply under Obama. In fact, about a week or two ago, there was a big federal operation, which I think the biggest one ever, which caught a huge number of, a lot of planning, caught a huge number of undocumented aliens and shipped them across the border. I mean, these can be people who've lived here since childhood, who have, families, jobs, doesn't matter. They're not persons, so we do what we want to them. Well, if we accept it, that's the society we live in.
Chomsky for kind of illuminating a bit of the background as to why we're seeing the border look the way it does now, and some of the economic policies and also the political decisions that have been influencing that. And so we're kind of hoping to have a bit of a conversation now about what is happening on the border, how those broader economic and political decisions are, as you aptly put it, playing out in human lives, and to kind of describe a bit more about the work that we're doing and what we're seeing on the ground, and how this all kind of relates. And so we're hoping to kind of open it up for questions. But before we did that, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about some of the abuse documentation work that No More Deaths does, because that is what Avi Chomsky was doing actually over spring break. No More Deaths runs an alternative spring break program. We also operate camps out in the desert for 4 months out of the summer when the heat often goes over 110 degrees during the day. And the abuse documentation work is where increasingly we're seeing a lot of these patterns in terms of what's happening with the raids, and also hearing the stories of the abuses that are happening in detention facilities and in short-term custody with Border Patrol. So volunteers with No More Deaths and with a lot of other organizations will take, when people are deported, they come back over the border a lot of times at night. They'll, have medical care available to them, food, a phone call home to maybe tell their family what happened. And it used to be more so that a lot of the stories that volunteers were hearing from migrants that were being deported were the stories of subsistence farming that was pretty much undercut by these broader policies. People that had lost everything and had no choice but to come north to try to take care of their families. And increasingly now, with the abuse documentation work, we're hearing more stories of long-term residents that have been people that have lived in the U.S. for 10, 11, 15, 20, 30 years, maybe their entire lives, aside from when they were little kids and they came over with their parents, who have been picked up in either these ICE raids or they have been reported to ICE by employers, if they're asking for an increase in their wages or something like that, are caught up in the criminal system and are being deported through some of the subtleties of immigration law in the U.S. That are reporting also. I mean, that's one element of it. So profiles, where we're hearing a lot of stories of families that are being broken up, that are being completely split apart, and people that are trying to get back into the U.S. To reunite with their spouses and their children and their jobs and their communities. But we're also hearing a lot more stories of extreme abuse at the hand of Border Patrol officials and people in these detention facilities as well. So there's a lot of stories that even came out of the spring break just recently of Border Patrol officers breaking bones of people that they encounter, of pushing people into cactus that they encounter in the desert, of psychological torture in terms of, say you're picked up and it's very, very hot out there often, and then you're put into a truck crowded with a group of other people, and then the AC is turned on. You're already dehydrated, and what that does to your system. People being forced to sign documents that aren't translated for them and signing against their will, having their possessions thrown away in front of them. And so that's another element that we're hearing that kind of is changing this dynamic too, along of what's happening on the border, but also what's happening in communities domestically, how families are being broken apart, how people are trying to get back in to see their family, and how border militarization is playing a part in that. So I just kind of wanted to describe a little bit about that, because that's another element besides the death toll, which by all accounts is largely inaccurate, because a lot of people that go missing are never found. But there's also these extremely severe abuses that are happening to people as well, that are crossing in and being picked up.
Well, most of this is for you, but just one comment on the incarceration. The incarceration is a neoliberal phenomenon. If you go back to the 1970s, before the neoliberal programs were instituted here, the rate of incarceration in the United States was approximately the same as Europe, a little bit on the high end, but pretty much the same. And crime in the United States is pretty much the same as other industrial countries. Actually, there's one exception in the United States: homicides with guns. But that's because of the crazed gun laws. But if you take that away, you look at the rest of crime, it's approximately like other comparable countries, and the prison rate was too. Now the prison rate is about 5 to 10 times as high as other comparable countries, not because of more crime. This is a way of getting rid of the superfluous population. It's mostly black or Hispanic, mostly men. And if you look at the history of African Americans, and the reason was that as the economy started becoming financialized and production gets hollowed out, there just aren't jobs for these people. They're superfluous. I mean, in one of our dependencies, like Colombia, the way they handle it is by what's called social cleansing. You send out the military and the paramilitary and you murder them. Okay, we're more civilized, so we throw them into prison. But the incarceration rate has risen steadily from the late Carter years through Reagan, through Clinton, right up till today, as the neoliberal programs have proceeded. So yeah, it's another aspect of it. And in fact, if you take a look at the history of African Americans in the United States, I mean, we all know that there was slavery until the Civil War. What very few people know is that slavery was reinstituted after the Civil War by criminalization. There was a compact between the North and the South in 1877 after Reconstruction was ended, which essentially allowed the South to criminalize black life. Literally. Some black guy's standing on a street corner, you can arrest him for vagrancy. He looks the wrong way, or somebody claims he looks the wrong way at a white woman, you can arrest him for attempted rape. The charge may be $10, but the system's set up so he's in there for life. He has to pay the corrupt judge and the lawyer, and he doesn't have it, so they're in there for life, and they became a slave labor force. In fact, a lot of the U.S. Industrial Revolution is based on slave labor from criminals in the South, what are called criminals in the South. Like U.S. Steel would go down there and terrific labor force. The state gives you the workforce free. You don't have to pay any attention to them. If they die, you get more. It's an endless supply of cheap labor. And much of the American Industrial Revolution, you know, steel, mines, and so on, comes out of that. Well, that went on until the Second World War. The Second World War, you needed free labor for war industry. So it ended, and there was a black migration to the north, and there were jobs because people had to go into war industry. There was a huge increase in production. And that persisted through the post-war period. There was a kind of a post-war boom, you know, went through the 50s and 60s, when, say, a black man could get, say, a job in an auto plant and get a pretty decent life, you know, buy a house and get a car and so on. Well, by the 70s, that was over. Policies changed. Now we direct policies towards enriching financial institutions and stopping productive labor here. Well, what do you do with those people? Stick them back in jail, where they're in fact again used for labor, forced labor. You look at the whole history of African Americans in the United States, there's a couple of decades in which there was some sort of relative freedom. But talk about the border.
So if, for example, if this bill passes, it's very likely that the rest of the country could see repercussions because it's succeeding in Arizona. We tend to get like the harshest laws passed. Another example is HB 2008, which passed in November, which said that anyone going to the Department of Economic Security, they're required to like show their papers, even if they're only going to pick up like food stamps for their kids who are citizens who have these rights completely entitled to them. So we have a lot of really like crazy immigration policy that just kind of resonates from Arizona into the rest of the country.
Organizers are try to get people to understand that the reason their wages have stagnated for 30 years don't have to do with undocumented aliens and welfare mothers. They have to do with fundamental decisions that are made by the masters to shift the nature of the economy so that its core becomes financial institutions. You go back to, say, 1970, financial institutions, big banks and so on, maybe had 3% of corporate profits, and now it's close to a third. And a side effect of that is something else goes. What goes is production. So if you buy a car here, even if it's a General Motors car, there's a good chance it was assembled in Mexico, not in a U.S. plant. And these are and those are the policies that are taking away sort of more or less the kind of jobs that you can survive on, raise a family on, and so on. They're taking away those jobs. Now, it's an old process. Like New England, it used to be the manufacturing center of the country, but manufacturing was shifted elsewhere, like to the south, because labor was cheaper, and in fact, because you could use slave labor, like the criminalized workers, so that manufacturing declined in the north. Okay, this is the same process continuing, except now it happens to be across the borders. I mean, it always was to some extent across the borders, but now it's much more so, to even cheaper labor under even worse conditions. You can make more money out of them. I mean, China, for example, working conditions are horrendous. That's why there's labor unrest all over China. But China has become kind of like an assembly plant to which the more advanced economies of Asia and the United States send parts and components and high technology, and they assemble it very cheaply for for Dell and HP and the rest of them. Great for Walmart, you get cheap goods, and working people here suffer. Well, those are the things that people ought to understand. It's not, and it's happening right before their eyes. Like it takes the Obama administration now pretty much owns the auto industry. What are they doing? Well, they're closing GM plants. When you close a GM plant, for example, you not only destroy the workforce, you destroy the community. I mean, a lot of these communities were built by the workforce in the auto industry or other industries. So they're closing GM plants here. At the same time, Obama's Secretary of Transportation, Roy LaHood, is traveling around Europe using federal stimulus money to get Spanish corporations to build high-speed rail facilities that could very well be built in that GM plant. But the banks and the owners make more money out of it this way. Well, you know, people ought to understand those things. For example, they ought to be taking over those plants and, you know, producing it themselves. And they ought to be, you know, doing things like what was happening in the 1930s. There was massive labor unrest, formation of the CIO, you know, sit-down strikes. That's what led to New Deal legislation. But it's got to be organized. People have to understand that it's not, you know, there was a nativist movement then too. Said it's all the fault of the Jews and the immigrants and so on. But that was overwhelmed by an active, organized labor movement. Well, that's not happening now, but it ought to be. And that's the kind of thing that people who have the kind of privilege that allows them to work through these problems ought to be bringing to people, not ridiculing them. In the short term, for example, I think that we should be rebuilding our productive apparatus and definancializing the economy. Most of the financial institutions don't do anything that's useful. Like when Goldman Sachs say what they're being charged with now, essentially taking bets, making bets against the rotten securities that they're selling, so that when the securities fail, they'll be insured by the debt, the CDOs so-called. I mean, there's no contribution to the economy from that, but it's a way for financial speculators to get rich, as they're doing. So that stuff should all be ended. You know, there should be banks that perform the function of banks. You know, you want some money to buy a car, you borrow some money from a bank or something at a reasonable rate. Okay, that's what financial institutions should be doing. And as far as the productive apparatus is concerned, it should be rebuilt. Now, those things don't happen by themselves. There's a reason why, say, the Asian countries are growing and developing. South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, China, to a lesser extent, Singapore, they have government programs. They have strong governments which establish industrial policies, which target investment and lay the basis for productive growth. Now, that's our history, too. I mean, if you use a computer and the internet and take an airplane and you know, whatever it may be, you're benefiting from the state economy. That stuff was produced mostly in the state sector of the economy, not by entrepreneurial initiative and consumer choice. It was done in universities, government labs, and so on. I mean, the internet was in the state system for around 30 years before it was handed over to private enterprise. So yeah, we had industrial, and that goes way back to the origins of American history. You know, we have an industrial system because we were highly protectionist. The state intervened substantially in production. In fact, the case of criminalizing black labor is a case in point. It provided a cheap labor force for, you know, Andrew Carnegie and so on. So if you have a functioning society with a strong government, and we would hope a democratic government that's developing programs of growth and development for the population, well, you can get economic growth. If you, the reason why the propagandists for small government are screaming about it is because they want people to hate the government. So, and that doesn't mean have a weak state. It means have a strong state, but for the rich. But cut back on. You take a look at the, you know, you listen to NPR, forget Fox News, listen to NPR and ask what the prescriptions are of the experts on how to deal with the deficit. Every single one says we're going to have to cut entitlements. We're going to have to cut, you know, medical care, Social Security, and so on. Well, you want to, if you're serious about the deficit, which you should be, there are ways to cut it back. I mean, half the deficit is military spending. You know, we spend as much as the rest of the world combined in military spending. That's about half the debt, the deficit. You know. The other half of the deficit, roughly, is the exploding medical costs from the highly inefficient privatized health system, which has twice the costs of comparable countries. Well, that's not touched by the health care reform because no matter what people want, the insurance companies are going to make sure that they're not touched. So there are ways to deal with these things, but they're going to shift power. They're going to shift power toward the population and away from concentrated concentrations, sectors of power. Now that's in the short term. You know, those are things that you can just legislate tomorrow. In the longer term, I agree with the workers in the mills and around here in the late 19th century, who took it for granted that those who work in the mills should own them. Yeah. Well, why should there be private ownership of the mill in which you're working? And you should have industrial democracy just like you should have popular democracy elsewhere. That's in the longer term. But you got to start somewhere. And there are immediate problems that have to be dealt with, real ones. Like take, say, environmental catastrophe. You know, that's pretty serious. If we don't deal with that, we're not going to have to worry about anything else. And it's being consciously exacerbated by inherent properties of the market system, the ones I mentioned. Not because the CEOs are bad people, but because that's their institutional role, to disregard externalities like the fate of the species. Well, we better do something about that, or there isn't going to be much else to worry about.
Well, first of all, as far as the Border Patrol having a brown population, about half of all Border Patrols are like non-white, and it doesn't really come into play when they're, apprehending migrants. There's no you would assume there's solidarity, but there really isn't. There's a big disconnect between Mexicans who believe that they have earned the right to come here because their family was born here, and those who have come here recently. My family has been in the United States for 20 years, but even I see in my dad, he even has some racism, and I think that it comes out of an attitude of fear because no one wants to associate with the underdog, so they'll put themselves in any position of power that they can find. It's also one of the highest paying jobs that you can find. It's very highly paid, but despite that, it's such a stressful job that there's a really high turnover rate. And as far as Border Patrol and the organization interacting, we've been dealing with increasing tension between No More Deaths and the Border Patrol because about a year ago, 13 people were given tickets for littering because we were leaving bottles of water in the desert. And this attitude is still going on, but we've had Border Patrol, for example, say you can't do this, you can't leave bottles of water in the desert because you're littering, but you'll slash the bottles in front of us, dump them out, and leave the bottles there. So it's just an increasing tension, which we're trying to dissipate as an organization, because we don't want to have that tension. We don't want to fight. We just want to be able to do our job. But there's a lot of negotiation that people are trying to make happen, but it's really difficult because of the high turnover rate. There are so many new Border Patrol agents all the time that it's impossible to build relationships. And that's actually done on purpose. As an organization, they don't want Border Patrol agents to build relationships with anyone in the area that they're working in.
Well, there's a policy now where they, with Border Patrol placement, because there's multiple sectors, Border Patrol throughout the country, and we just operate within the Tucson sector, which is the most deadly. There's over 50% of all the deaths that occur on the border happen in the Tucson area. And there's a policy, on the books, to switch people's placements every 6 months, so you prevent them from maintaining ties. So, I really see a lot of border policy and militarization about breaking up communities and preventing communities from organizing together. And I think that the racial component of it is a really strong element. And I think that's what this new legislation is also reflecting.
So, thank you for coming. I guess we'd like to point out that No More Deaths always is taking volunteers. Over the summer, if you want to come out and volunteer, that's great. You can just go on our website and apply.